Chapter 17, Religion, Solzhenitsyn, and the Russianness of Russia. Russia cannot be understood by wit alone. Common measures cannot be applied to her. She has a special character. One must simply believe in Russia. Fyodor Tyutchev. The West has fallen into belated disenchantment with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a mark of its earlier misconception of the man and of the Russianness of Russia itself. Solzhenitsyn confounded Western expectations. People were disconcerted that the heroic dissident who had documented the terrors of a police state should also scorn democracy. It became a nuisance that he was such a moral absolutist, so obsessed with his holy mission to purge Mother Russia of Stalinism and Marxism that he would not stay the volcanic flow of his works when foreigners were sated. It was a shock that when his own manifesto appeared, it offered not a model of an open urban scientific society joining the modern world, but a mystic vision of a future past, a dream of Holy Russia, resurrected by turning inward into itself and pulling away from the 20th century. Westerners, quick to focus on dissent from the left in their own image, too easily disposed to ignore the Russian right, found his prescription awkwardly archaic, yet his strain of religious Russophilism articulates a whole syndrome of feelings and sentiments that have strong pull on large numbers of Russians. Solzhenitsyn himself, I found on first encounter, never fits preconceptions. Dissidents are not supposed to be dictatorial, yet the willful Russian autocrat in him manifested itself almost at once and produced the most baffling interview that I have ever had. It took place in early '72, when such undertakings were not without peril, for Solzhenitsyn then lived in the very jaws of the Leviathan, a solitary, defiant soul, with the audacity to assert his full freedom as a writer and to challenge the entire apparatus of the Soviet state by publishing works like Cancer Ward and First Circle abroad when Soviet authorities suppressed them. For ideological heresy, he had been excommunicated from the Writers' Union. To contact him was to venture into a politically radioactive zone. The after effects were uncertain. Our meeting was arranged with conspiratorial precautions to avoid tipping off the authorities. Secret negotiations were conducted through Boris Medvedev, the dissident biologist. Never was the topic mentioned indoors for fear of bugs. Medvedev himself occasionally resorted to code language. Bob Kaiser of the Washington Post, my partner in the endeavor, once overheard Medvedev telling someone by phone that he had forgotten his briefcase. Noticing that Medvedev had the briefcase, Kaiser inquired, "What was that all about?" And Medvedev said it was the signal to fix the meeting with Solzhenitsyn for Thursday, March 30th. On a night when Solzhenitsyn was out of Moscow, we were given a dry run past the old cream-colored apartment building where the interview would take place. To prepare questions in privacy, Kaiser and I went skating at a deserted outdoor rink near Lenin Stadium. So blasé have Westerners become about Solzhenitsyn's exile in Zurich that they have forgotten the breathtaking vulnerability of his existence in those years, the constant fear that each new act of defiance would hurl him back to slow death in Siberia, where he had languished for 8 years and contracted cancer after his arrest for some critical remarks about Stalin in a wartime letter to a friend. In those days, Solzhenitsyn was a totally secluded figure. Almost no one saw him, let alone for an interview. In magnificent silence, he had created a sensation by appearing bareheaded at the wintry funeral of Alexander Tverdovsky in December of '71. Tverdovsky, as the liberal editor of New World magazine, was the man who had persuaded Khrushchev to permit publication of Solzhenitsyn's first searing novella of the Stalinist camps, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Again, the excitement was electric when in mid-March Solzhenitsyn went to the Moscow Conservatory for a concert by Mstislav Rostropovich, this cellist who had brooked the Kremlin's anger by giving shelter to Solzhenitsyn in his dacha. Controversy was building around August 1914, just published in Russian. A new confrontation loomed because Solzhenitsyn was defiantly bent on having a private ceremony in Moscow to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature, which he had won in 1970. He had never dared leave the country to collect it for fear that Moscow would slam the door on his return. By prearrangement, Kaiser and I met a few minutes before noon on March 20th at a food shop not far from apartment 169 at number 12, Gorky Street, curiously located not on Gorky Street, but a block behind it. As we edged down the side street, our gaze fixed on a uniformed police officer at the entrance. We froze like a couple of bank robbers caught burgling a safe. A stakeout we had expected, but not a sentry. For contact with lesser dissidents, other reporters had been interrogated by the KGB or thrown out of the country. We did not want to be nabbed, even before seeing him. How could they have found out? Kaiser whispered. Don't know, I stalled. Maybe they just moved with him, and he's brought one in from Rostropovich, his country house. We walked on a few paces, then decided to reverse course and go around the block on the odd chance that the policeman was there, purely by coincidence. Luckily, when we came out of the alley, the policeman had moved down the block, and only a babushka was hobbling past the door. We slipped into the entryway, flew up half a flight of stairs, rang the bell, and waited for an eternity. Solzhenitsyn himself opened the door, but only a few inches, his eyes dark and penetrating, peering out intently, searching, checking, questioning. I could see his full, rust-brown beard, and beneath it a soft gray pullover. He looked like the few pictures I had seen, but bigger, taller. He kept the chain latched while we muttered uneasily about Medvedev sending us. Satisfied, he unlatched the door quickly to permit entry. Just as quickly, he shut and bolted it again. That sense of conspiratorial wariness never lifted. When I saw him nearly 3 years later in Zurich, he was still on guard. Even among the Swiss, he had a special lock on his garden gate, and he was mistrustful of the telephone. Inside the apartment, his greeting was warm. He introduced us to Natalya Svetlova, a dark-haired woman with a round face, large soft eyes, and about 20 years younger than he and his wife. He was then 53, she was 32, and a mathematician. It was her family's high-ceilinged old apartment where we were meeting. Legally, she and Solzhenitsyn were not yet married because Soviet courts were engaged in highly irregular delaying tactics, preventing his divorce from his first wife. Eventually it came through, but already Solzhenitsyn and Natalya were extremely close. He openly depended on her for advice, research help, and moral support. Far better than he, she had a gentle capacity for reaching out to others. Yet with this sympathetic side went an inner toughness and contempt for the Soviet system that matched his own. I would come to see it in the strenuous weeks after his enforced exile in '74, when she was left behind to gather his archives and bring them and his 3 sons safely to him in Switzerland. Nightly, the family would gather in the kitchen, listening to Western radio broadcasts telling how he had gone to Norway, followed by reporters, and they would ask me and other newsmen about the West. With the family's fate still uncertain, the strain on her was immense, but she did not waver. Doggedly, she fought for every scrap of material of value to him and refused to leave Russia until all was ready. Clearly, Natalya had created for Solzhenitsyn something for which he had ached throughout his life, a sense of family. His own father had died before he was born, and he had no children by his first marriage. Now he drew strength from biological procreation, as well as from his literary work. When I happened to catch him by phone after his harrowing deportation, just as he arrived at the home of Heinrich Böll in West Germany, Solzhenitsyn's first question to me was, "Have you seen my family today? How many hours ago? How are they?" He made me promise to relay to them the news that he was well and unharmed. And when I did, Natalya said that it was the first time she had believed since his arrest that he was still alive and had not been shot or carted off to Siberia again. In '72, at our first meeting, they already had 1 son, Yermolay, a blonde 15-month-old toddler who played on the floor and babbled with his parents in some private family language. Solzhenitsyn was terribly proud of his son. The easy informality of those first few minutes disarmed me, for I had expected to be overawed by this living classic of Russian literature. Solzhenitsyn was warm and engaging. He was also physically more dynamic than I had expected, bounding out of chairs, moving with athletic ease across the room. His enormous energy was palpable. For a man who had suffered so much, he looked well, but his face was etched beneath its surface ruddiness by the trauma of camp and cancer. It reminded me of a well-worn table, its scratches, nicks, and scars visible through a veneer. Steel molars flashed when he smiled. A dark tobacco stain on his index finger marked him as a heavy smoker. The spell of easy informality, lingered as long as we dallied in the small talk of first acquaintance. Sitting in the book-lined den, a Sony tape recorder and several stacks of papers on the writing table, but as soon as we turned to substance, we confronted his imperial will. I can still hear his voice, taut and hard, in the tense days before his final arrest and enforced exile, summoning me on the phone. "This is Solzhenitsyn. I have something I want to discuss with you." The way he said it, he might as well have been saying, "This is the Tsar. Come quickly to the palace." It was unfortunate, he told Kaiser and me that first day, that he had needed to advance the timing of our interview because that kept him from receiving our written questions as planned. He had gotten a gist of our interest from Medvedev, and so, to help things work smoothly, he had prepared some material, a statement. I thought incredulously, all this trouble and we wind up with a prepared statement. But it was not a statement. He handed us each a fat copy of written material from the writing table, headed "Interview with the New York Times and the Washington Post," and there it was, the whole thing, questions and answers, all prepared by Solzhenitsyn. I was stunned. What an irony, I thought. This is the way it is done at Pravda, and here is Solzhenitsyn, whose entire being reverberates with his furious battle against censorship, a man who in the great tradition of Pushkin and Dostoevsky had dared to assert the writer's independence, producing a prepackaged interview. How could he be so blind or so vain? I thought of walking out. This is outrageous, I muttered to Kaiser. We can't do this. Kaiser was more practical. Let's read it first, he suggested. That was what Solzhenitsyn was urging, so I read. It began like a patsy Soviet interview. Alexander Isievich, what are you working on now? Eventually, we would have gotten to that, but we wanted to open with broader themes about the general fate of writers in Russia from Pushkin to himself. Was censorship, exile, and disgrace the inevitable condition of Russian writers, regardless of regime? What had happened to the cultural vigor and ferment of the Khrushchev thaw period? What other Russian writers were now composing secretly, as he had once done, and would burst upon us in the years ahead? I handed him our questions and argued with him to go over them. While we read his material, he withdrew, leaving us alone with Natalya. It was fortunate she stayed behind. Solzhenitsyn's prose is a dense, complex form of Russian, hard for the best translators to handle because he deliberately avoids the many words that have seeped into modern Russia from German, French, or English. One element of his Russophilism is to employ the purest Russian. For both of us, in the country less than 6 months, it was a struggle to skim, let alone read, 25 pages of his heavy, archaic prose. Natalya was an immense help. Translating his Russian into more ordinary Russian we could understand. The process was tortuously slow. Periodically, Solzhenitsyn would stick his head in the room, surprised at our plodding pace, but humoring us. After an hour or so, when Natalya went off to get us a pitcher of berry juice and homemade fruitcake, I protested to Kaiser again about the whole artificial procedure. But he doesn't understand that, Bob observed. This is his first interview in years, 9 years, he says himself. Maybe he doesn't understand. The irony was cruel, but it showed how much Solzhenitsyn had been conditioned by Soviet life. It was a reflection of the myopia of Soviet dissidents who were as ignorant of the ways of the West and as unprepared for the untidiness of democracy and the awkward, probing questions of the Western press as Soviet authorities themselves. Here was Solzhenitsyn, an uncompromising foe of the Soviet system, using Soviet methods because they were the only ones he knew. The material, however, was anything but Soviet, a poignant story of his harassment as a writer, how he was barred from government archives, how elderly survivors of World War I shut up out of fear of talking to him, how he was prevented from hiring research assistants, and how he had to rely on haphazard voluntary help, how his mail was checked, his living quarters bugged, his friends shadowed like state criminals, and his wife, Natalya, illegally dismissed from work when an institute director found out her relation to Solzhenitsyn. They decided to suffocate me in '65, he wrote. You Westerners cannot imagine my situation. I live in my own country. I write a novel about Russia, but it is as hard for me to gather material as it would be if I were writing about Polynesia. A kind of forbidden, contaminated zone has been created around my family. The plan is either to drive me out of my life or out of the country, to throw me into a ditch, or to send me to Siberia, or to have me dissolve in an alien fog. It was charged with the compelling detail about the demeaning harassments of Soviet life that made his novels world famous. Then followed page after page of esoteric arguments about the social background of his grandparents and about his father's death, Solzhenitsyn's angry rebuttal to slurs against his family in the Soviet press, suggesting that he came from wealthy forebears and that his father, a Tsarist army officer, had committed suicide. He had been especially stung that the West German weekly Stern had printed this material too and felt it was a KGB plant. He was expecting another broadside in the Soviet press within a week and was determined to strike before new slanders were launched. Here we were, face to face with Solzhenitsyn, the grand antagonist condemned in the Soviet press because of the West so often picked up his criticisms of Soviet society, taking it for granted that the Western press was his vehicle. If he had to be his own defense attorney, he assumed that the West would provide him partisan witnesses and a partisan jury. He was obsessed with the tactics of combat against those who were out to discredit and destroy him. I was amazed. Not only did he want the interview printed in full, but immediately, several days before his planned Nobel Prize ceremony. This was certain to give Soviet authorities a pretext for not issuing a visa to the Swedish Academy representative who was to bring him the Nobel Award. Perhaps some martyr complex impelled him to risk something he so deeply cherished. Perhaps he reckoned the ceremony would be blocked in any case. Perhaps his combative temperament made him want to fling down a challenge, for he said he intended to invite the cultural minister and 2 Soviet journalists to his ceremony. Perhaps it was some deep-seated arrogance that made him believe he could get away with releasing the interview and also holding the Nobel celebration, for he gave us our invitation to the small private ceremony, which was fated never to be held. The crucible of the camps had given him not only immense moral courage and authority as a writer, but had forged diamond-hard the single-mindedness of an autocrat. He was incredulous and unyielding when I said that the New York Times could use only about half of the 7,500-word text he had prepared, and that we must put some of our own questions to him. We don't even guarantee the American president to print his every word, I reminded him. Kaiser, too, was concerned by Solzhenitsyn's demands. He thinks the world is hanging on his every word, Bob whispered to me. The Post, he said, could handle little over half. Both of us felt that Solzhenitsyn's arguments about his family were of only limited interest in America, but that was what Solzhenitsyn wanted to print most. He left the room again, and we tried to explain our problems and our way of journalism to Natalya. When Solzhenitsyn reappeared, he offered to let us take what we wanted so long as we pledged to have the rest printed in some other Western publications. We explained we had no power to promise that. He left again and reappeared with a compromise. Suppose, he said, that a Swedish correspondent had taken part, and the Swede agreed to print the parts we omitted. But there is no Swedish correspondent, Kaiser objected. With that, Solzhenitsyn disappeared again and returned with a slender, sandy-haired young man whom he introduced as Stig Fredriksson, the Scandinavian news agency man in Moscow. Now, he declared, here is a Swedish correspondent, and he promises to print the entire text, but he will do it a day after you release your stories. Once again, I was stunned by Solzhenitsyn's high-handedness. We had not met Fredriksson before, nor had we seen him enter the apartment, but he was obviously the reason for Solzhenitsyn's shuttling in and out of the den. Clearly, he had arrived without expecting an interview, possibly with news from Stockholm, for he quickly assented to Solzhenitsyn's conditions. and was speedily ushered out of the room while we wrangled with Solzhenitsyn and his wife for another couple of hours. We found a few places where his material meshed with our questions. Natalya seemed to glean how artificial his text sounded to Western ears, and eventually he agreed to substitute our formulation of several questions. We argued long and hard about our broader queries, which he found too sweeping, too political, and evidently too precarious. For he was careful to control every word attributed to him to ensure that it could not be used against him in unexpected ways. Finally, he relented and vaguely responded to 4 questions, recording his answers on his tape recorder. Reluctantly, I concluded we had made a passable compromise, but later I learned how it had angered and frustrated Solzhenitsyn, for after the interview appeared, he wrote me a personal letter complaining that I had indulged in unnecessary fictionalizing in my description of the setting and the way he had opened the door, and that I had destroyed the coherence of his material by placing our questions ahead of his interview, which he later released in Russian, since the Swede, too, was unable to publish it fully enough to satisfy him. But that day, Solzhenitsyn relaxed and let us photograph him with Natalya and Yermolai. When I shot pictures of him alone, he wore a solemn face and would not be coaxed into a smiling portrait. There is nothing to be happy about, he insisted. After more than 4 hours, Kaiser and I left exhausted. We made our way nervously to my car. On the way home, I missed a turn, and when I stopped to make a legal U-turn, someone rammed me from behind. Immediately, both of us suspected an accident staged by the KGB to catch us with tapes, cameras, film, and Russian text. Kaiser scooped up all the material in an instant and fled in the confusion, while I occupied the police, who were slow in materializing. To my relief and amusement, it turned out to be only a reckless cabby who had plowed into my trunk and whose passengers, like Kaiser, had fled to avoid any entanglement with the authorities. The police were very polite and helpful, totally unaware of our contact with Solzhenitsyn. Our stories went out a couple of days later on schedule. It was nearly 2 years before I had another private audience with Solzhenitsyn on the eve of his arrest and deportation in February of '74. He called me to release ahead of time a section from Gulag Archipelago in which he acidly charged that retroactive decrees, fixed trials, and judges given secret instructions by political bosses made a sham of Soviet justice in political cases, not only under Stalin but today, too. That day, the air was heavy with omens of Solzhenitsyn's impending doom. More abuse had been heaped upon him as a traitor and renegade by the Soviet press than on anyone else since the Purge trials. The streets near the Gorky Street apartment were thick with police agents loitering on the sidewalks or sitting in foursomes in the back in black Volga sedans. Walking among them was like swimming through jellyfish in late August. Brazenly, Solzhenitsyn had defied 2 warrants. He had taken the precaution to prepare a survival kit for the inevitable arrest, including the old sheepskin jacket he had worn in his first Siberian exile. Now he was deliberately sounding the alarm to the West by firing off statements. His courage at the eye of the gathering storm was remarkable. We talked for a while about the difficult prison jargon in the segment of Gulag that he gave me. No interviews, he insisted smilingly, remembering our first encounter and refusing the entreaties of Murray Seeger, of the Los Angeles Times and Eric Damani of the BBC, who came with me. Damani did, however, get him to read aloud the segment of Gulag for a recording, with Natalya standing behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders, his own hair flying in his face. Solzhenitsyn sat at the writing table. His mood changed, his voice, often quick, high and taut, dropped to deep and moving resonance, as if he imagined an audience before him. His reading rustled with the richness of the Russian language and bristled with his own sarcastic barbs. His implicit warning to the West was that it would not heed the lessons of the police state until Western liberals themselves had to jump to the bark of prison guards commanding, "Hands behind your back," in Russian, "Ruki nazad," and he sharply rolled the R's as if hearing an inextinguishable echo of the years when he had bent to that command. A day later he was gone, carted off by 7 agents, stripped down, interrogated, held incommunicado, accused of treason, threatened with death, and then forcibly exiled, like a character from one of his own novels. The entire drama seemed a reenactment of the stage-managed execution of Dostoevsky in the 19th century, who was spared by the Tsar as the firing squad was about to take him, and then banished to Siberia, except that Solzhenitsyn was deported to the West, a fate he once described as spiritual castration. By the time I next saw him in Zurich in December of '74, he had endured what he had described to friends as the first withering agonies of being uprooted from his beloved Russia and being separated from his family, uncertain whether he could go on writing, and fearful that he literally would perish without family and work. By then he had released his Letter to the Supreme Leaders, the personal manifesto that stunned the West. Previously, only glimpses of Solzhenitsyn's Russophile philosophy had come through. Now it was explicit. In the most stridently anti-communist statement by a major Russian figure since the revolutionary period, he turned his back on the 20th century. Like Count Leo Tolstoy, he spoke with the voice of a mystical apostle of Holy Russia, a religious fundamentalist, a back-to-the-up unspoilt village Russian patriot. His vision of the apocalypse was an unwinnable war with China brought on by foolish ideological rivalry, or the Russian people threatened with extinction because modern urban technological society was devouring natural resources and defiling the precious Russian landscape. He pictured the West as the source of evil importations, the false god of modern technology, and the dark, un-Russian whirlwind of Marxist ideology. America was democracy run riot, a culture in decline because it lacked moral underpinning. Russia, not the Soviet Union, but Russia proper, could find salvation by casting off Marxism, shedding its East European empire and the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union, and turning inward away from Europe to develop the Russian interior in the northeast. Let it remain authoritarian, he said, as so long as Marxism were scrapped as the state creed and Orthodox Christianity became the moral foundation of a new order. Solzhenitsyn invoked the soul-soothing silences, the human scale, and the moral goodness of the Russian village. He urged the leaders to give up mass production and reduce the economy to small-scale and manual production, to abandon internal combustion engines in favor of electric cars and horses, to remember the glories of two-story homes, the most pleasant height for human habitation, and to stop destroying old Russian architecture, build new towns of this old type. He commanded, make the Northeast the center of national activity and settlement, and a focus of aspiration of young people. Recognize, as Stalin had in World War II, he told the Kremlin that the nation should be rallied around the banner of Russian patriotism, Russian, not Soviet, and around the Orthodox Church. And he reminded them, when Stalin made those appeals in war against Hitler, we conquered. However far-fetched Solzhenitsyn's ideas sounded to Western ears, his was not as isolated a voice as many Westerners assumed. He had placed himself in the mainstream of classic Russian Slavophiles, that part of the Russian national mentality that has suspiciously rejected passive imitation and admiration of the West, that has proclaimed a sacred and unique mission for a Russia standing apart from Europe, and has vaunted Russia's spiritual superiority over other nations, the trinity of Church, soil, and Mother Russia that Solzhenitsyn held aloft was earlier professed by Dostoevsky. His rural populism echoed the 19th century People's Will movement, the Narodniki. Even today, after half a century of communist indoctrination, other Slavophile dissenters have put forward similar views. Actually, Solzhenitsyn is more Russophile than Slavophile, because Slavophilism embraces other Slavic peoples and projects an imperial role for Russia. Perhaps more important, Solzhenitsyn's articulated a broader undercurrent of nostalgia for Russian past, a reviving interest in Orthodox religion, a rural romanticism, and resurgent great Russian nationalism, companions of modern ideological apathy. His letter seemed almost intended to offer the rationale of patriotic ideology for a military takeover. He also seemed to imply the suspicion that even one member among the current leadership might sympathize. Indeed, the 35 billion ruble program for developing the depressed North and Central Russia farmlands that Brezhnev announced in April of '74 had a ring similar to Solzhenitsyn's preaching and was supposedly pushed by a Russian First faction within the leadership. When the Kremlin decided to postpone for several years an offer of large, long-term Siberian oil sales to Japan, I heard muted official expressions of economic nationalism like those Solzhenitsyn advanced. In spite of the taunt, the isolationist strain in Solzhenitsyn has great resonance among Russians in the hinterlands, a people more isolationist and more provincial than so-called Middle Americans. Solzhenitsyn's romantic evocation of provincial Russia and its village life is echoed in a flow of officially published works, idolizing the moral purity and the genuine Russia to be found in the countryside, what Solzhenitsyn and dissident Slavophiles like Vladimir Osipov have stated explicitly, an establishment film director like Vasily Shushkin has conveyed implicitly in his film, The Red Snowball Tree. The Russian nation cannot be saved without the moral force and of the peasantry to halt the cultural disintegration brought on by modern urban life. In a similar vein, an entire school of officially published Village writers like Fyodor Abramov and Vasily Belov and Viktor Astafyev have written tales subtly decrying the crude collectivist transfiguration of rural Russia by the violent intrusion of the modern Soviet state. Yuri Lyubimov, the director of Moscow's avant-garde Taganka Theater, took two of Abramov's stories to stage: Wooden Horses, a moving and effective representation of the moral goodness of the old peasantry, before collectivization and progress transformed their lives. It has generated a strong following among urban intellectuals. We have a mixture of the psychology of Asia and the culture of Europe, and we are now slowly returning to our Russian sources. Vladimir Maximov, a Slavophile writer, told me before hounding by the authorities forced him into exile in Paris, if it were not for the Chinese problem, we would do it more boldly, but the Chinese force our leaders to defend our ideology. Solzhenitsyn's instinctive urge to protect Mother Russia from the intrusion of alien influences from the West also has resonance in official Russian life. At the very time he was being deported, no less worldly a figure than Nikolai Fedorenko, the former Soviet representative to the United Nations and editor of the magazine Foreign Literature, published an article lamenting the wholesale borrowing of foreign terms that were polluting the purity of the great Russian language. In an echo of the 19th century Slavophiles, Fedorenko was distraught at the intrusion of such terms as nonconformism or nonconformism, as Russians render it, populism, academism, détente, mass media, secularization, establishment, and kidnapping. The word eklastia entered usage with the light touch of Pentagon strategists who used it in connection with American aggression in Vietnam. Fedorenko fumed. Then various combinations of words were used, from eskalastya of war and eskalastya of aggression. A transition was made to word eskalastya, ideological, intellectual, emotional, and later de-eskalastya, anti and contra eskalastya. Is the Russian language so poor, has it become so impoverished? Fedorenko wailed, though insisting he did not want to build a Chinese wall around the Russian tongue. He called for an urgent campaign to promote pure Russian and to curb uncontrolled borrowing from Western languages. Too many modern-minded Russians, this is a hopeless rearguard action, because Russian is already saturated with words like press, relish, credit, transistor, kokel, kritz, dash, and decency pants, not to mention entire vocabularies in the natural and social sciences and in literary criticism. Nor is the trend new. Peter the Great and Catherine the Great brought Dutch and German borrowings in the 19th century. The influx of Gallicisms permeated art, literature, military life. It is purists like Solzhenitsyn and Fedorenko who want to turn back the clock to prevent what Fedorenko derisively termed weeds of barbarism from sprouting in rich Russian soil. They are not alone. Even such a prominent organ of Soviet ideology as Komsomolskaya Pravda was vexed enough to protest that Russian children did not know about Lapta, but were hearing about baseball, which essentially is nothing but Americanized Lapta brought to California in the old times by Russian settlers. It advocated reviving old Russian national games, just as we lovingly restore monuments of the past. The undertow of Russophilism today is palpable but difficult to gauge because it is more mood than movement, more hidden than open. Its milder forms are tolerated, even officially encouraged, as Russia progresses is its culture and political influence outward among other nationalities, which have been absorbed into the Soviet Union and which now outnumber ethnic Russians, a demographic fact that worries ethnic Russians so much that some government officials and specialists advocate higher birth rates in Russia proper to stem the trend. A subtle political manifestation of Russophilism is the special praise that Brezhnev, an ethnic Russian raised in the Ukraine, sometimes bestows on ethnic Russians as leaders in the formation and development of the Soviet state, and the tribute he pays to the Russian Republic. As first among equals, technically it is one of 15 Union republics, but it carries preponderant weight over half the population and 3/4 the land area of the country. Similarly, President Podgorny, a Ukrainian, has asserted that the Russian language is a mighty instrument of unification and interconnection among the diverse Soviet peoples. In many minority areas that we visited, we found persistent official efforts to promote learning of Russian as the modern scientific language, the language of Lenin, and schools organized so that in big cities more children were often being encouraged to take Russian as a compulsory course than their own native language. From 59 to 70, millions of ethnic Russians moved into the Baltic republics, Central Asia, and the Ukraine, more than 2 million to the Ukraine alone. The resettlement was concentrated in major cities, so that in some republics, ethnic Russians outnumbered the main local nationality, causing serious underlying frictions against Russians. I remember an Estonian poet in despair lamenting to me that we are like your Indians, a dying breed, over a slow persistent Russification in his area. Party leaders across the country are constantly on the attack against local nationalist sentiments. In places like Lithuania, Georgia, Armenia, the Ukraine, Uzbekistan, because such feelings have broad, latent popular support and contain the most serious threat of decentralization and disloyalty faced by the Russian-dominated Soviet state. At times, too, Russian nationalists are officially rapped on the knuckles, but with all 9 top Communist Party secretaries being ethnic Russians and with Russians dominant in key administrative posts throughout Soviet society, it is more acceptable to promote Russian nationalism than the nationalism of any minority group. Strictly speaking, Russophilism goes against the grain of Marxist-Leninist ideology. The undertones of narrow Russian patriotism and religious feeling conflict with the proletarian internationalism, militant atheism, and multinational unity of Soviet peoples preached by the party. but the line of tolerance is often fuzzy because Soviet communism during and since the war has contained a fair quotient of Russian supranationalism, sometimes veering off into a Russian equivalent of Ku Klux Klan chauvinism with reactionary anti-Semitic and an anti-foreign prejudices. Jews I knew were especially sensitive to super-patriotic Russity, as they were called, publishing and promoting books like Caution Zionism by Yuri Ivanov. Time and again, liberal Soviet intellectuals insisted privately to me that Russophiles could count among their hidden protectors important officials in the Communist Party, the secret police, armed forces, and Komsomol Youth League, men who were ardent Russian firsters, some of them neo-Stalinist and anti-Semites, and others with vaguer right-wing Slavic mistrust of the West and Detente, and a yen for glorifying the mystique of Russia. With this kind of official sympathy and protection, two conservative monthly magazines pitched toward youth, Young Guard and Our Contemporary, have become known as center of right-wing Russianism, outlets for paeans to the Russian village, neo-Stalinist fiction essays idolizing historic Russian conquests, or eulogies to the majesty and loftiness of the Russian soul. One Soviet journalist confided that after Khrushchev's devastating exposé of Stalin, the armed forces desperately needed something for indoctrinating young soldiers, and appeals to Russian patriotic pride offered a good alternative to ideology, though only in the Russian Republic, because elsewhere it would generate resentment among minorities. Under the former leadership of Sergei Pavlov, a staunch conservative, the Komsomol League organized Rodina Motherland clubs in the mid-60s to study pre-revolutionary Russia as an antidote to Western cultural influences among youth and to try to fill the ideological vacuum left by Khrushchev. Not until I fell into conversation one day with a little old doorman at the 69th Parallel Hotel in Murmansk did I discern how the blood and soil patriotism of ordinary Russians differed from that of Americans or Britons. So flattered was he to find an American-speaking Russian that he launched into a peroration about the beauty and richness of the Russian language, and an explanation of how that richness of the tongue and the strength of the Russian nation came from the soil. With his age-softened hand holding mine and friendly eyes relishing my attention, he related a mystic story about an ancient sage who advised Russians to take the good Russian earth and put it in their mouths, to eat it and take in its nourishment directly, because the very soil was the source of Russian character and culture. Later, reading Slavophile writings with similar passions, I thought of the little doorman. A West German diplomatic friend told me, too, of an Easter evening Orthodox service to which he had been taken by a Communist Party member. They had not gone inside, but stood among a crowd of onlookers at the church on Lennon Hills, watching the midnight procession of priests and believers. "Look at that," the Russian said excitedly. "I am a communist, not a believer, but it is good to see these old Russian customs preserved and coming back. The most innocent manifestations of this traditionalist mood are the faddish hunger for collecting and hanging religious icons or the craze for czarist antiques, hobbies that establishment figures from writers and generals to ministers indulge in. In the early 60s, under Khrushchev, buying antiques was frowned upon, a journalist wife told me as she showed off a handsome Alexandrian chest of drawers and an armchair from another imperial period. We wouldn't have thought of buying these things then, but the situation has changed, and all kinds of people are doing it. Paradoxically, it was Stalin, Georgian by birth, but great Russian in mentality, who made the reclamation of the Russian past respectable. After the suppression of Russian nationalist feelings in the first 15 years of Bolshevism, Stalin encouraged the revival of Tsarist heroes, movies glorifying Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and Alexander Nevsky's heroic battles against the German knights, themes perpetuated today. He put epaulets back on military uniforms, re-established ranks and Tsarist decorations, lavished special praise on the great Russians for their leading role in the war against Hitler, and allocated post-war reconstruction funds for restoring the treasures of the Hermitage and the grandeur of Tsarist palaces. Since Stalin, Soviet policy has ebbed and flowed, treating the Russian heritage ambivalently. The great music, literature, and ballet of the 19th century are revered. Monuments have been raised to such purely Russian triumphs as Marshal Kutuzov's victory over Napoleon. Some major cathedrals and churches have been restored as monuments, but hundreds of other architectural treasures have been razed, and history has still been written in communist stereotypes. When official policy flagged the renascent Russianism among the intelligentsia, sometimes stepped in. One celebrated case occurred in 1973. Word leaked that the Kremlin, decreeing that Moscow should be made a model communist city, was about to approve a plan to rebuild its central district and rip down such architectural landmarks as the old Tsarist Municipal Hall and Museum of History next to Red Square, Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theater, and the 18th century Mali Theater next to the Bolshoi. Some of the nation's most prestigious scientists, artists, musicians, and other intellectuals banded together to protest and succeeded in blocking this plan. Earlier in the mid-60s, students from Moscow State University's archaeological faculty rushed out to provincial towns in northern Russia and managed to save some old churches slated for destruction by recategorizing them as top priority historical monuments. In those years, musical groups like the Russian Republic Academic Choir under Alexander Yurlov or the Madrigal group formed by composer Andrei Volkonsky resurrected church chants and canticles. Other composers drew on old religious motifs for modern works. I knew writers, artists, and other intellectuals who roamed the Russian countryside, visiting monasteries, church ruins, and distant rural settlements, collecting artifacts of old Russia, from icons and books written in Church Slavonic to antique pots, wooden objects, and farm implements. The icon fad caused enormous inflation in that field. Black market prices also skyrocketed in the past decade for books by such early 20th century Russian religious philosophers as Nikolai Berdyaev and Pavel Florensky, who not only opposed Marxism but advocated a radical renovation of social life on the basis of Christian faith, themes that Solzhenitsyn has now sounded again. Joseph Brodsky captured the mood of the nostalgic Russian revival in a lovely poem called A Halt in the Desert. The dogs, moved by old memory, still lift their hind legs at a once familiar spot. The church's walls have long since been torn down, but these dogs see the church walls in their dreams. Dog dreams have cancelled out reality, and if I were to speak in earnest of the relay race of human history, I'd swear by nothing but this relay race, this race of all the generations who have sniffed and who will sniff the ancient smells. No ancient smell is more vividly unforgettable than the exotic incense of an Orthodox Mass, and no institution more central to Renaissance Russianism than Orthodox Christianity. For centuries, the Church has been a special guardian of Russian culture. To a foreigner accustomed to picturing the Soviet Union as a land of militant atheists, the magnetism of Orthodox services on such high feast days as Easter is hard to believe. It astonished me to see that it was primarily young people in their late teens and 20s who congregated outside the old cathedrals for a glimpse of the rich pageantry within. But anyone who knows Russia understands that churches are her artistic glory. One Easter Eve, Anne and I were swept up among a crowd of Vladimir, once a medieval capital of Russia and now a provincial city. Thousands of people were swarming to the imposing 12th century cathedral of the Assumption, trimmed with stone carvings and serene beneath its decorative domes and the rhythmic repetition of its rounded arches. Driving to Vladimir, we had stopped at a farmhouse on the road cutting through the flat, barely budding farmlands that swept eastward from Moscow, and watched a strong-armed farm woman kneading dough for the traditional kulach Easter cake. She had already made pashka, a rich and tasty mixture of sweetened cheese curds, butter, and raisins, and had dyed her Easter eggs a soft russet color by boiling them with onion skins. Later, we had seen old women bring their holiday food to the cathedral for blessing. In the flickering candlelight, they laid out bread and cakes on a long, low table, flowers adorning their dishes. According to the Eastern Orthodox rites, Russians celebrate Easter with a Saturday midnight Mass that lasts for several hours. In Vladimir, secular authorities had organized an outdoor dance in a park near the old stone cathedral, obviously to distract the young, but the expedient worked only temporarily. By 11:30, when the dance broke up, 3,000 to 4,000 young people had encircled the church and were pressing against lines of police and auxiliary police who held them back. Inside, where we were, the ceremony of Christ's resurrection had transformed the cathedral into a place of mystical enchantment. It was ablaze with forests of candles that illuminated innumerable icons encased in gold or silver and lavished with the kisses of the faithful. Bearded priests in gilded robes were swinging censers or passing an ornamented Bible studded with pearls and precious stones. The repetitive litany and the melancholy, disembodied chants of the choir, somewhere up in the lofts, had a hypnotic effect. Churchgoers craned to see the choir and to glimpse the carved Baroque iconostasis of the world-famous frescoes of Andrei Rublev. It was a terribly Russian scene, with its Eastern Byzantine emphasis on the beauty and power of the ritual creating a pious state of mind rather than Western Protestant sermonizing to appeal to the individual conscience. There were no pews. The worshippers, 100 strong, filled the cathedral, watching, waiting, listening patiently for 2 or 3 hours. As the climactic moment approached, the church was so jammed I found it impossible to move, even a few inches, yet there was something soothing in the communal presence, and the mesmerizing hum of the priest's chants, and the quiet crackling of waxed candles burning before the icons. The candles reinforced the communal bond of the service. People brought them at the rear of the church and then passed them forward, shoulder to shoulder, hand to hand, and instructions were whispered stranger to stranger, so that each new candle would be lit before the chosen icon of its distant, invisible owner. When the priest emerged from the cathedral, followed by the faithful, in a candlelight procession, to pass 3 times around the church, symbolizing the search for Christ's body in the sepulchre, this produced an irresistible surge among the throngs of young people outside. Just as the procession returned into the cathedral to celebrate the resurrection, several hundred broke through the human wall of police. Theoretically, the police lines were here to shield the believers from interference from young hooligans, though just as surely their function was to screen off the young from the attraction of the forbidden ceremony as the dam broke. I heard a couple of babushkas worrying that the young would break the icons or laugh at worshippers, but from what I saw, those who made it inside were quiet, respectful, and above all, curious. A few squirmed into the congregation for a look at the priest and iconostasis, the 5-tiered altar screen of icons, or to hear the choir. One or two had tape recorders to record the ceremony, a far more colorful pageant than anything offered in Soviet secular life. "Why did you want to go in?" I overheard one police officer later asking a slender blonde girl who had come outside carrying a lighted candle, glowing with excitement. "I wanted to see it," she replied firmly, uncowed. "It was very interesting, very beautiful. I saw that sort of scene several times, and it left me feeling that, left to their own devices, the common folk would heed Solzhenitsyn's call to turn to the church. Its grandeur, its ceremony, its communal feeling suit the Russian soul." In Vladimir, as elsewhere, older women comprised the main body of regular worshippers, 70 to 80%, though, as one middle-aged man, a believer but not a churchgoer, smilingly remarked to me, "When each generation of old women dies off, there always seems to be another generation to take their place. At ordinary church services, I have seen a fair sprinkling of middle-aged men and women, an occasional military uniform, or a few young people carrying a prayer book, lighting a candle or crossing themselves, not to mention the intermittent stream of curious young onlookers. But the pressures and controls of the Soviet system still make it risky for people from 20 to 50, especially those with career ambitions, to attend church. Old women go fairly freely because the system has given up on them. Nonetheless, there is evidence of a modest religious revival in recent years among the middle and younger generations. No less authoritative source than Pravda complained, in a long article in '74, of a notable increase of religious interest among young men and women, coupled with widespread ideological apathy. Other Soviet publications, like the magazine Science and Religion, have let slip information that in recent years, as many as half of the newlyweds in some areas, including Moscow, were having church weddings, and more than half of the newborns were being baptized. Baptisms are a regular target for the party press. To combat them, authorities began requiring the priest demand domestic passports from parents as a form of intimidation, but people told me you could get around that by going out of town and renting the documents of other people. One encounters manifestations of hidden interest in the church or in religion in various little ways. An endorsed guide asking an American businessman for a Bible, a Russian priest confiding to a Western pastor that he has little time to counsel young people because he is so busy doing 1,000 baptisms a year, a young woman who carefully draws out a visiting Catholic priest to explain his faith and then expresses her admiration for it, a young engineer who keeps icons in the corner, the traditional place of worship, and who knows verses from the scriptures. Periodically, communist publications berate party members or Komsomol members for participating in weddings, funerals, and other religious ceremonies. In 1973, Pravda Ukraini reported that while one party official was lecturing on atheism, his children were being taken for baptism by his wife and mother-in-law. Some sensational incidents are hushed up. A writer told me that when Alla Tarasova, a leading actress of the Moscow Art Theater, a party official there for 19 years, and a deputy in the Supreme Soviet, died in 1972, she shocked party officials by leaving a will requiring a religious burial, and her husband, a secret police official, fulfilled her wish. The late Ivan Petrovsky, for 22 years rector of Moscow State University, was another secret believer for years, this same writer informed me. Once noticing that a highly educated woman, a computer expert in her mid-40s, was wearing a cross, I asked if she was a believer. She glanced down at the cross, smiled at me with embarrassment, and tried to sidestep the question. "It's an Armenian cross. I don't go to church," she said. "I don't like a crowd of people." "I understand about your not going to church. It's a big risk," I said. "But what I meant is, are you a believer?" We were in Moscow, in her Moscow apartment, alone among her family, but she was still hesitant. Finally she acknowledged, yes, in the sense of believing in something. Her eyes glanced upward. "And not going to church. I'm a believer, but I have no Bible. Some time ago I got little books of 4 of the Gospels." She went and fetched 4 little books, not much larger than matchbooks, from behind an overstuffed chair. "I read them quite a bit, and I find they help me," she said. "Sometimes I read them to my children." "Are there many scientists your age and with your level of training who are also believers in your sense?" I asked. "Many," she nodded. "Like me, they do not go to church, but they believe." "Why?" I asked. "Most of all, out of frustration with the emptiness of life here, the emptiness in our contemporary life. Religion gives something to hold on to. That is how I feel." Vladimir Osipov, a Slavophile dissident, has written that some middle-aged intellectuals turned to religion in recent years because of the shattering experience in the late 50s and early 60s of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign. "All of us future heretics were Stalinists in the prime of our youth," he wrote. "Without Stalin," he said, "they felt lost." I found it impossible to judge how widely either Osipov's or the lady scientist's views were shared, but I am skeptical that there are very many religious converts, even loose ones among scientists or those with whom I talked. Most were drawn toward the Orthodox Church as a vessel of Russian culture, a link with their suppressed heritage. The relation of the Church and the party is a curious one. As an institution vigorously repressed in the 20s and 30s, allowed to revive by Stalin during World War II to rally Russian patriotism, and later roughly suppressed by Khrushchev, the Orthodox Church has accepted uneasy accommodation with the Brezhnev leadership. Throughout Russian history, the Orthodox establishment has reinforced secular power by preaching submission to the state among its faithful, and it does so now. Patriarch Pimen and other Orthodox prelates make obligatory speeches praising Soviet policy at home and abroad. The Church donates millions of rubles to the Soviet Peace Committee and other communist causes. With such tactics, it has survived and claims 30 million churchgoers, twice the number of card-carrying communists in the country, though the numbers have limited meaning since it is the party that sets the terms under which the churches can exist, not vice versa. Other smaller churches, like the Roman Catholic Church in Lithuania and Baptist elsewhere, have more vigorously asserted themselves and have been subject to more repressions. Tacitly, the party has acknowledged orthodoxy as an essential ingredient in the peculiar mixture of loyalties that holds the Soviet state together, a vital element of its Russianness, but it has hemmed in the church with restrictions. Priests can celebrate Mass but not preach or proselytize. New cities are built without churches, and in some old regions, like the western Ukraine, established churches are shut down. The more outspoken priests are defrocked or disciplined. There is a shortage of priests, and though the rector of the Zagorsk Theological Seminary told a group of us foreign correspondents that they have 4 applicants annually for each seminary opening, the state does not permit the 4 Orthodox seminaries to expand beyond the 1,000 places they now have. Dissidents like Solzhenitsyn chafe at this kind of accommodation by the church and manipulations by the party. In 1972, Solzhenitsyn sent a stinging letter to Patriarch Pimen charging that the church had forsaken its flock, let houses of worship be razed or ruined by neglect, and had become a tool of the atheist state. Some defrocked priests, refusing to submit to the party's dictates, have set up underground monasteries for more radical believers. I was told by a Western churchman with considerable contacts among Russians. One, he said, was composed entirely of scientists. On rare occasions, an ordained churchman dares openly to pursue aggressive priesthood. The most striking preaching priest during my experience in Moscow was Father Dmitry Dudko, a short, balding cleric in his 50s who had spent 8 years in the Stalinist camps after his arrest in 1948 for writing religious poetry. Later he became Solzhenitsyn's priest. In early 1974 he created a sensation with a series of extremely candid question-and-answer sessions at the small old church of St. Nicholas in Moscow. On Sunday evenings, 500 to 600 people, many of them intellectuals and young people, packed the church. They were drawn by his sincere and untrammeled preaching, his moral questions about how to live, and his comments on the state of Christianity in the Soviet Union. Often his daring remarks brought gasps. I remember myself barely squeezed into the creaky door of the church, wondering if I were in Moscow, when I heard his blunt attacks on atheism. Without the usual circumlocutions, he asserted that Russia had suffered moral and spiritual decline during the half-century of Soviet rule. It was time, he said, to speak out for Christianity. He told simple tales of religious conversions, recalled the strength of believers in prison camps, and protested the interference by the godless in the internal affairs of the church. Finally, one evening, he charged that the church hierarchy was so penetrated and the patriarch so surrounded by informers that he sighs, and it is heard by all the organs, a Russian euphemism for the KGB. People went away asking how long this could last. After 10 such sessions, the authorities intervened. Father Dmitry was silenced, made to apologize to the patriarch, and shipped off to an out-of-the-way rural parish. The international notoriety that his case attracted may have protected him from much harsher punishment. A number of religious Slavophile dissidents have met sterner destinies long before Solzhenitsyn's exile. The authorities cracked down on a group of right-wing, reactionary, militantly anti-Soviet Slavophiles calling themselves the All-Russian Social Christian Alliance of Liberation of the People. Their writings circulating in Leningrad, Tomsk, Irkutsk, and other cities in the late 60s not only had Slavophile but anti-Semitic and neo-fascist overtones. Russian friends told me that some of them had supposedly jotted down license plate numbers of Communist Party officials and talked of violence. In '68, a score of more were tried secretly and given long sentences. In '71, another group anonymously circulated an underground manifesto of Russian patriots that rejected Marxism, favored a return to an Orthodox Christian state, preached a strong brand of Russian nationalism and white supremacy, unlike Solzhenitsyn, but shared his preference for authoritarian rule, a common feature of the Russian right. If they were caught and punished, it never came to light, but Vladimir Osipov, a square-jawed, broad-shouldered, pacifist, Slavophile writer who had edited a series of underground publications like Vesh, the name of a medieval Russian assembly, and Zemlya, Earth, has faced persistent repression despite assertions that he does not oppose the established order. In '61, he was sent off to Siberia for 7 years, and then after a period of exile outside Moscow, was arrested again and sentenced in '75 to 8 more years in a strict labor camp for circulating his journals in the West. In late '74, several of Solzhenitsyn's followers collaborated with him in publishing a book in the West entitled From Under the Boulders. It is a series of essays analyzing the moral decline in Soviet society from a religious viewpoint, rejecting Marxism and reviving the thought of Berdyaev and other early 20th century Russian religious philosophers. One obvious objective was to provoke debate of Russophile views among Soviet intellectuals. Even before it appeared, 2 contributors, Vadim Borisov, a church historian, and Yevgeny Barabanov, an art historian, both in their early 30s, were fired from work, and Borisov was also kept from defending his academic dissertation. Igor Shafarovich, another contributor, has evidently been protected by his eminence as a world-renowned mathematician in his early 50s and a corresponding member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, though I was told of repeated efforts to dismiss him from the Moscow University faculty. The dilemma of Soviet authorities so far has been not in dealing with blatantly distant Russophiles, but in managing the broader, more amorphous, renascent Russianism and religious interest within the establishment. Cultural watchdogs periodically berate writers for dwelling too much on the past, book illustrators for idealizing peasant life under the czars, or musicians for reviving so much old church music. But the party itself seems to be split on how to strike a proper balance, evidently because of the Russophile influence within its own ranks. In late '72, for example, the head of the Central Committee's powerful Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Alexander Yakovlev, published a major commentary condemning various magazines and writers for romanticizing Russia's past, glorifying traditional village life, and showing excessive respect for old churches and historic monuments. His article seemed to signal that the party wanted to curb great Russian nationalism, but a few months later, Yakovlev was quietly dismissed and demoted to a diplomatic post abroad. Russian intellectuals told me that a behind-the-scenes argument had taken place in high party circles over whether his article should have been printed. The message to some of them was that someone up top in the very inner circle disapproved of his approach and wanted to protect the renascent Russian nationalist mood.